As revelations of Downing Street parties have slowly trickled out, we've often asked this question: which Westminster journalists knew? Given how close MPs and journalists are, indeed they're often married to each other, it would be a surprise if a rule-breaking party to which 100 people were invited had gone completely under the radar. We now have confirmed at least one mainstream journalist who did know about parties at Downing Street. That's because one of them was for him. James Slack was Director of Communications for Boris Johnson until April 2021, and one of the two parties, which were held on the day before Prince Philip's funeral, was James Slack's leaving to. The job Slack left Downing Street for: Deputy Editor of The Sun. Slack today released an apology via News UK, that's the company which owns The Sun. So he said, "I wish to apologise unreservedly for the anger and hurt caused. This event should not have happened at the time that it did. I am deeply sorry and take full responsibility." James Slack said he could not comment any further on the matter as it had been referred to an investigation being carried out by Sue Gray. So the same excuse that everyone involved in this has had so far. I'm sorry if I've caused offence, but I'm also not going to answer any of the facts of the matter, even though I clearly know them all because I was there. I'm going to wait for some civil servant to answer the question. Aaron, for almost 9 months, The Sun have missed an exclusive sitting right in front of their noses. They've let the Telegraph take it, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Telegraph knew for a while, considering how close they are to people in Number 10. Why has it taken 9 months?
I have a sort of theory, Michael, that the Telegraph went with it to take the pressure off Prince Andrew. It's quite interesting to see the different newspapers with their different affiliations and political priorities and their values and what they're willing to dead cat. I don't think the Telegraph wants to talk about 10 Downing Street, but takes a bit of heat off Her Majesty's son. Perhaps just a theory. In terms of the Sun's coverage of this, for our audience out there, anyone who's watched Succession with Brian Cox and a plethora of other actors, a great drama. It's based on the life of Rupert Murdoch, and the news network that's based around is Fox News, built by Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes. And believe me when I say this, reality is more sensational than fiction. And these outlets and how they operate and what stories they don't allow to be released to the public and what they choose to cover and not cover, sins of omission and commission, are astonishing. And I think this is just the latest example of that. The fact we have somebody who is going from 10 Downing Street to The Sun, and it's just taken for granted. It's just normal. And of course, the fact the story isn't covered, well, we can infer as to why. How many more stories are there, Michael? And I can't help but go back to Matt Hancock. The Sun, of course, got that exclusive. We still don't know where that camera came from. And the fact that they can make or break a member of the cabinet and then they protect one of their own like this, it does say a lot about the relationship between politics and media in this country, and it's not a healthy one. If a billionaire-owned newspaper like The Sun, which, by the way, doesn't make money, which would appear to indicate that it's owned purely to advance political interests, those of the Murdoch family, if a billionaire-owned newspaper can make or break politicians who are elected by the people, I think that says something quite dangerous and terrifying about the quality of the democracy we live under.
It is also worth, I think, appreciating the alternative sequence of events where we didn't find out any of this, because I think that's quite possible. If you think about what has happened, the sequence of events, which means we have found out about these parties, it could easily have not been the case. So what happened? The first ones we learned about were at the beginning of December. That was clearly because someone who, now finds himself factionally opposed to Boris Johnson decided that they wanted to leak a very old story. They leaked it to the Mirror, a newspaper who they knew would probably want to run with it because they're not a pro-government story. The Mirror ran a bunch of stories before the Telegraph then piled in, before the other newspapers piled in. So I think the Telegraph and the Sun, etc., would have sat on these stories forever if it wasn't the case that there was someone who didn't like Boris Johnson, or presumably potentially a former ally of Boris Johnson who turned against him, who then leaked it to the only real left-wing paper in the country. So if there hadn't been that factional opposition within Downing Street, we would never have found out.
The Mirror might not exist as a major publication in this country in, say, 5 years' time. The Daily Mirror is owned by Reach. It's a big organization, has lots of local newspapers, but the Daily Mirror, the Sunday Mirror, in terms of circulation, has been hammered more than any other major newspaper over the last 20 years, and it's not slowing down. So they're going to have big problems. And I can't help but think of a media landscape like Australia, where Rupert Murdoch, I think at one point owned like 60% of all the newspapers in circulation in the country, just something extraordinary. And if you didn't have a paper like the Mirror, I don't particularly like the Mirror. I don't think it's a great newspaper. I think I like the Guardian. I read the Guardian. I don't read many Mirror stories. Of course, these Mirror scoops have been really good. I'm not criticizing that. But prior to that, the Mirror hadn't really broken any stories for a really long time. I certainly wouldn't buy it. Just my personal opinion. People can choose to read or watch or listen to whatever they like. But if it hadn't existed, like you say, Michael, there wouldn't have been this sort of ideological ballast that we need. And I think that, to me, is emblematic of the arguments for media diversity. Whether or not you're on the left or the right or the center, you do need a range of outlets with different viewpoints and different interests. Otherwise, you will have stories like this sat on very frequently. And of course, we see that a lot. We see that, for instance, with how stories on the Labour left are reported. We saw it in the asymmetry of how if a left winger says something objectionable on social media, they would be crucified, destroyed. If a centrist does it, we've got a number of stories like that. The story of the councillor in the last week, Philip Normal, if they do it, it's reported on a wholly different way. I mean, some of these stories, they're not even reported on at all. And the reason why they're not reported on at all is because the Mirror or the Guardian don't have any interest in reporting on it. But of course, nor does the right-wing press. So you have a kind of fait accompli between the right-wing and the centre-left press. You kind of just squeeze out left-wing stories or stories where socialists are being demonized unfairly, and you kind of ignore it because, why do we care? And so I think that really is an argument for diverse media ownership, a diversity of newspapers, broadcast channels, et cetera, et cetera. And while I do think the BBC does serve a very important purpose, which is public service broadcast, we talked a few weeks ago, last week rather, about, well, why haven't we had widespread COVID sort of conspiracy theories in this country like in the US? The big kind of answer for me on that is the fact we've got this big public service broadcaster, 70, 80% of radio and TV news market share. So the BBC is good for some things, but it's not very good for exclusives. It's not very good for original news gathering to set the news agenda. It doesn't want to do that because it doesn't want to upset the powers that be, because of course government determines BBC budgets on a decade-long basis. And so I think, yes, of course you need the BBC, you need public service broadcast, but I would like to see greater subsidies for, like I say, a broader range of media outlets, both by geographical spread. We need to, subsidize local news in this country, but also at the national level too. Because like you say, Michael, this story could have been sat on. And the terrifying thing is there are stories of this magnitude which have been sat on for precisely the reason you're saying.